Welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I'm Kate Dickerson. My conversation today is with Alicia Wilcox, who is an associate professor of criminal justice at Thomas College. Alicia is a forensic scientist who both teaches at the college level and provides expertise in cases throughout the country. She has been a presenter at the Maine Science Festival quite a few times, and her sessions have always been popular and informative. It was great to learn more about Alicia's work in forensic science. Her passion for teaching, whether it's college students or attorneys, is clearly evident. One heads up before we start. Alicia and I get into some details about a murder crime scene, different kinds of violent crimes including child abuse, and autopsies. Our conversation is very straightforward and may not be suitable for young kids. Alicia, welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. You're at Thomas College. Every university is different and every college is different. I know Thomas does not have a law school, but you do a lot with forensics. So maybe you could give us just a quick overview of your position at Thomas, and then I'm going to make you go back in time and talk about how you got there.
Okay, so I'm in my third semester here at Thomas College. I'm an associate professor. I teach in the schools of arts and sciences, and I teach both criminal justice classes and I teach forensic science lab classes. We have a new area of concentration in forensics here at Thomas that I developed there a few weeks ago. So that's an option for students to take if they wanted to focus on hands-on learning and practical lab, crime scene, evidence evaluation skills that they could use later on in their future careers.
I know that you have multiple degrees, both undergraduate and graduate, starting with chemistry and statistics, if I have that right. Why chemistry for you?
So I did my high school and undergraduate work in Ireland, where I'm originally from. And there's a lot of pressure on Irish students to choose around the age of 16 when you're in high school, what are you going to do for the rest of your life? And I see that here in Maine too. But the undergraduate degrees in Ireland are free. In a sense, the tuition is free. So if you choose a 4-year degree and stay within that program, in a sense, you can come out without any student loans for the tuition portion. So if you have to repeat a year, you'd have to pay for it. So there's an incentive to try to get into the college and the course that you'd like. So I thought I wanted to be a speech therapist. It was kind of in vogue in the mid 90s to say, oh, I want to work with people. So I would say, I want to work with people. So I thought I might want to be a speech therapist or a speech pathologist. So my mom, who was a psychiatric nurse at the time, both my parents were, set me up with a colleague in the hospital. So I shadowed a speech therapist for an 8-hour day, and I hated it. The poor people dealing with throat cancer, and they had the little electronic devices to help them speak, and people that had problems with their palate, and I hated it. So my other job that I thought I would really like would be occupational therapy. So I followed one of those therapists for a day too and hated it. So then I became disillusioned. I was around 16 and a half. And then I realized, no, I actually don't want to work with people. I do not want to work with people. So I started to think, what am I good at? What do I enjoy? So the really only classes I liked in high school were science classes. I loved biology and chemistry and mathematics. I struggled. We had to learn Irish, the native language, and I struggled with Irish and French. I liked history too. So I said, I think I'll go to college and do science. So that was great. That's what I headed off to do. I went off to do a general science degree, and halfway through our degree, we had to kind of major. So you could major in biology, you could major in physics, math. And I really loved chemistry, but I wasn't very good at it. Well, I didn't get high grades, and I liked mathematics and I liked statistics, and I got really good grades. And then I figured out the university I went to, if I did a dual major, they added the 2 grades together and averaged them. I said, I'll take statistics because I'll probably do really well in that, and they'll average out my grade of chemistry. So that's what I did. Loved chemistry, but never really got A's or anything like that. And I got A's in maths, so they kind of averaged them out. So that's how I got my undergraduate degree in majoring in those 2 areas. But halfway through, I started to think, well, what am I going to do with this science degree? A lot of people enter degree programs and they, if you enter a nursing program, you're probably going to be a nurse. So I, again, started to get hot under the collar halfway through my degree and go, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? So I started going to the career services at the university. And back then there was no, you couldn't search University of Maine and see what graduate programs they had. They were in what we call prospectus books. So there were these walls and walls of books of all of the different master's degrees from all of the different colleges all over the world. So I started to read those on a Friday afternoon for a few hours for probably 6 months. And then I found 3 different graduate programs that I was interested in. And one of them was forensic science, which they didn't offer in Ireland at that time. And I didn't know what forensic science was. It wasn't a show on TV. I just read up about it. And I remember coming home to tell my mom on the weekend, I just said, there's these people who they analyze evidence and then they go to court and they describe it, and they get to work with police officers, and they have to talk to attorneys. I think I might like to do that. So I had no other scientists in my family. I suppose my parents as nurses were, that could come under the umbrella of science. And I had my uncle Sean. He was a science high school teacher, so he had gone to college for science, but I didn't know any lawyers. I didn't really know any police officers. So I didn't have a vision of what one of these forensic scientists would be. So I applied for that master's degree in Strathclyde University in Glasgow, and I got in. They only took one Irish person every year, so I was very fortunate to get in with my average grades. They offered me a conditional spot if I got a second-class honours or higher, so luckily enough I got that, and off I went and did my master's in forensic science. And I knew probably in the first month that I'd hit gold, because I really enjoyed the classes. I felt it was just a really good fit for me. And that was the year 2000. So that's 20 years ago now. And I'm still excited about the field. I love to read textbooks, journal articles. My podcasts are all forensic science related. And I think it was because I took those Friday afternoons like a kind of a geek in the career services office, to try to think, what's my personality? I tend to get bored very quickly. I did all the high school sports for a week. My parents were demented with all the equipment. They said, we're not buying you equipment for this new sport until you do it for longer than a few weeks, because I would jump on to something else. So forensic science has been great because no 2 days are exactly the same. No 2 cases are the same. I was worried with my chemistry degree that I'd be doing quality control on acetaminophen pills. A lot of chemists go into those kind of careers, quality control. They're always hiring, and people don't know that about Ireland, but there's huge, Pfizer is huge in Ireland. The County Cork is, the last I heard, they make all of the world's Viagra, and Lipitor comes from Ireland, so you might not know that. So a lot of chemists would be funneled into that. So I didn't want that kind of a career, wasn't for me. So to be able to have a job, looking back now and knowing myself a little bit better, where you can combine science and communication. You can be quiet in the lab. You're not dealing with patients in the hospital. You can go to an autopsy and the person doesn't talk back. And then you're communicating with police officers and working alongside them. That's a really nice part of the job. And then working with other attorneys that are really smart and been to law school, but they are often terrified of science, and they rely heavily on the forensic scientists to help them navigate through. I'm working on a few post-conviction or death penalty cases at the moment out of Florida, and they are so appreciative. Can you tell me what this means? And they struggle because, unfortunately, a lot of them took only one science class. They are only required to take one science class. And when I ask them, the majority say they took Nutrition 101 because they didn't really want to do anything more difficult than that.
You mentioned that you grew up in Ireland. How did you end up in the States, and how did you end up in Maine?
So at the end of my master's in forensic science from Strathclyde in Glasgow in Scotland, I did my internship we were required to do an internship at the forensic lab in Dublin. So I worked there and developed some standard operating procedures around that time. That would have been 2000, 2001. Ireland had added anabolic steroids and a date rape drug called GHB, which is a liquid form, to be controlled substances. So they made the law, and then they'd no way to analyze. They said, okay, these are illegal in Ireland, but how do we know what they are? So as an intern, I worked in that lab and set up some procedures that they could use to, by the end of my internship, they were able to analyze those substances and confirm if they were controlled or not. So they hired me on right afterwards. There was a bit of a problem with the union. My boss hired me without posting the position, and it's a union job. So he said to me, "You're fine here for the moment, but I would recommend that you look for something full-time permanent somewhere else." So I went ahead and started looking to any English-speaking countries because I didn't want to have to testify in French or Spanish, because as I said earlier, those were not the strongest subjects for me. So I applied to lots of jobs, over 200, and 2 of them were in Augusta, Maine. Lots of the jobs I applied for in England, they said I was overqualified because I had a master's degree. They didn't think I'd stay. It was a bit disheartening, and I say that to students, just because you're a good student and you have a degree, you need to persevere and keep, don't let yourself get knocked down if you don't get interviews. So I only got 2 interviews, one at the UCD, University College Dublin. They were looking for a person who would drive around Ireland and calibrate the intoxilizers. So you would make sure that they were calibrated. I probably would go around every month. And so people who were pulled over for operating under the influence, the machine that they would use would be calibrated and would be accurate. So I didn't get the job, and I called for feedback, and they said my interview went really, really well, but they hired for somebody from within. But they encouraged me to apply again if there was another opening. So I applied for 2 jobs in Augusta, Maine. I had been to Maine as a student on a J1 visa the summer of '99, and I lived in Cape Cod and Hyannis, and we did rent a minivan, and we drove up to the Forks and did whitewater rafting. So I'm like, oh, Augusta's the capital of Maine, and I passed it on the highway when we went up north, and I had a kind of a visual of where I was applying to. So I applied to a latent print position and a firearms position. And I heard back a few weeks later to be called for an interview. It was just right after September 11th. There were no flights when I was called, so I had to wait, talk to the crime lab director at the time, and I had to wait until the flights had got going again. Everybody was afraid to fly. So, and I did fly over, I think it was the end of September that year. The terrorist's vehicle was in the garage. As part of the interview, they gave me a tour. The terrorists rented the car in Maine and drove down to Logan, as far as I can remember. And so the car came back to Maine for processing. The FBI had been at the lab to process the vehicle. And I interviewed, and I got the job. Not immediately, a few weeks later, they called me to say that I had the job. And that's where my career began then in Augusta, Maine. I moved over in February 2002 and started and worked there for almost 10 years.
That's a pretty big move, both distance, but also culturally. How is that adjustment for you?
I was young, so I was 23. I had a one-way ticket. I remember my first day on the job, I had a 5-hour polygraph. I remember my first thoughts were everything was so much bigger. Like, you can't get a gallon of milk in Ireland, like big milk, big cereals, big grocery carts. The cars were bigger. The parking spaces were bigger. The stores were bigger. Everything was bigger. That was, and then the cold. So I arrived into Boston, and I was supposed to fly up to Augusta from Boston, but my flight got cancelled. So I had to spend a night in a hotel. And just for example, even the light switches in Ireland are different. So when I got into the hotel, I'd never eaten a meal by myself in a restaurant. So even though I was hungry, I decided I'd prefer to go to bed hungry than go down to the hotel and eat by myself. So that was kind of where I was from a maturity perspective. I couldn't turn on most of the lights in the hotel room because they were twist buttons, like the lamps that we're all familiar with when you twist. I didn't know how to do that. So I think there was one main light that had a normal switch, and I turned that one on, and I didn't have a cell phone, so I probably used the hotel landline. I probably called home just to let them know I was okay, and spent the night in the hotel, got breakfast the next morning, and my flight headed off to Augusta, landed. I'd never seen icicles hanging off a car, so I remember, and I'd never seen a snow plow. So the weather was a shock. Nobody understood what I was saying either. I used to speak really fast, so Irish people speak really fast. I think Americans speak slowly. I'm American now as well, since I'm a citizen since 2013. So yeah, it was definitely a culture shock. Some people would sometimes look at my colleague in the office and say, "What is she saying?" Very rude. what is she saying? Instead of saying, could you repeat yourself, please? So it was a definite culture shock. And it's been 20 years. And normally the first thing people say to me when they meet me is, where are you from? So I'm constantly reminded, there's not a day that goes by that I'm not reminded that I sound different, that I'm not, where are you from? And when I go to conferences across the United States, I tell them I'm from Maine. So they're like, oh, that's a very unusual accent. I'm like, I let them, so they think Mainers sound like me.
I think that's great. What did you do at the crime lab? Did you have to kind of do a jack of all trades, like every type of forensic science, or did you focus in one area?
Well, I'm hoping that most labs nowadays now have specialists in each different area, unlike CSI, where they seem to do everything, which is unrealistic on the show. Most all accredited labs have specialties. So my area in latent prints was primarily fingerprint and palm print comparisons, and a subdiscipline for us were footwear and tire marks. So I did the training in friction ridge impressions. That's what we call fingerprints, friction ridge impressions first. And then once I was signed off on that, focused on, learning what's the difference between a manufacturing characteristic and a randomly acquired characteristic on a shoe or a tire. So probably about 30% of my job was footwear, and the other 70% were fingerprints. And that, they're in all cases, burglaries, sexual assaults, murders. So we worked on arsons, threatening letters. So all those types of cases, looking for fingerprints and, comparing them, searching them through databases, fingerprinting deceased people, trying to identify unknown deceased people, things like that.
So I have two questions. One, what are the other areas of forensic science just that people look at? And secondly, how much does a footwear change? Like, do you have a foundational understanding and then you just have to know what all the other types of footwear are that come out every year, or does that not matter?
Let me answer the footwear question first, and then I'll go back to the other areas of forensic science. So it's not necessary that I know all the different patterns that are developed, because how could we? So each year, all the different footwear manufacturers are trying to come up with new patterns and new technology for running or for basketball, whatever, the skateboarding shoes. But we have databases that we can search. So if we have a partial pattern, we can search them. We don't have a database in Maine, but we can send them out to another lab that could do that. And we have, you'll be surprised, we've got chat rooms. So there's footwear examiners' secret chat rooms on not the dark web, the normal web. And we can say, hey, guys, have you seen this one? And they, I had that last week, and that's a such and such. And then they might send you a picture. So Zappos, the footwear manufacturer, works with forensic scientists because they put a lot of photographs of uppers on the website, but we're interested on the pattern that's on the sole. So most people, when they go to buy sneakers or buy shoes, they're not necessarily examining the sole. So Zappos will have photographs of the soles that they can send us to. The FBI are a great help. And all of the footwear manufacturers can be contacted. Is Nike, is this yours? And they'll say, yes, that was ours. And especially on cold cases, where we look back at older cases, they will have records on how many size 10s were sold in 1993, for example. So we don't need to know all of that. Well, we do need to know if manufacturing changes, because some parts of the manufacturing can cause little bubbles to appear in the sole. So a brand new shoe might have a bubble in a certain place over and over. We'd want to make sure, as a forensic scientist, that when we see that at a crime scene, we're not saying that's a randomly acquired characteristic, like something that happened from wear and tear. So the manufacturing process, to understand that, is important. To come back to your other question on all the different areas, so there's the area of a trace examiner. So a trace examiner would look for fibers and for hairs, condom lubricants, adhesives, so any traces, soil. They would deal with all of those areas. And if it was a really, really big lab, somebody might just be a fiber examiner. Or if you're in a smaller lab, you might do hairs, fibers, and all the other traces. It depends on the volume of casework coming in. The FBI have fiber examiners. And in fact, when I did this in college, I hated it, because you'd just be looking at a microscope all day long. Some people like to do that. And that's wouldn't be my cup of tea. There are fire and explosive examiners. They would look at, a lot of those work offshore, and they help with IEDs in Iraq and Afghanistan and things like that. So they can work for the federal government and for the military. There's firearms examiners that will are very busy at the moment for illegal hunting. So you might not think of that, but we protect the green laws that we have here in Maine. So if deer or moose or other animals are illegally hunted, they will compare the bullets from the animals to the firearms that are retrieved. Very much like what you might see on Northwood's Law. They sometimes focus in on the crime lab for that. There are arson examiners. So there are forensic scientists that deal with fire debris, so evidence that's collected at crime scenes to look for accelerants to see, was there gasoline on this pillow? Was it an accidental fire, or was it set on purpose? And then, of course, I'm skipping over one of the big areas that we all talk about is biology and DNA. So it's another area. Now, that's not to say a forensic scientist wouldn't come in as a DNA examiner and work in that area for a period of time. I know a colleague of mine at the crime lab, she was a forensic chemist, and she did a lot of work on presumptive and confirmatory tests for biological stains. So the forensic chemists do a lot of work on bed sheets and clothing and sexual assault kits, looking for presumptive for semen stains. And then if they get a color change, presumptive positive, then they will go ahead and look for sperm cells, and then the sample will go over to a DNA examiner. So evidence often goes from one person to another in a sort of a predetermined sequence. The last people in the line are often the firearms examiners, where they shoot the gun to see if it still works. It would be examined by a fingerprint examiner before that, and maybe even a trace examiner before that. So the colleague I was talking about, she worked as a forensic chemist for approximately 15 years and cross-trained into DNA now as a DNA examiner. So it's still a career that you could stay in for, the life course if you wanted to, with the opportunity to take on a new discipline if you wanted to.
So you're not at the crime lab anymore. You're at Thomas College. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you teach your students and what else you may be doing.
So I teach my students criminology. So I just finished a criminology semester, and we talk about, precursors, what causes people to commit crimes. I taught a class this semester too, crime scene processing and evidence preservation. Those students learned how to approach crime scenes. Mostly they were mock homicide scenes that I'd set up, how to approach crime scenes in a systematic way so that evidence doesn't get damaged or cross-contamination doesn't happen, and that evidence is packaged properly. I also taught a class called evidence evaluation, and that class was lab-based, where students examined cartridge cases of bullets and compared them to each other. We did bloodstain pattern analysis to find out if we could find the angle of impact of bloodstains on surfaces, and then come back to the area of origin. We worked on different scenes to do with arsons, and we talked about spontaneous human combustion. So all of the different areas of forensic science, and I'm able to bring in my previous cases. So any cases that have been adjudicated, and I've got permission to show them what a decomposed body looks like, show them what a decapitated person might look like. Not in a sense to have a gruesome factor, but just to, some of the students are hoping to go into careers that might involve them looking at bodies, so that they've seen that in advance. What I'm working at the moment, a few years ago, 2017, an individual who was on death row in Florida appealed his conviction to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court heard his case. I should probably know the name of the case, but I can't think of it now. And the Supreme Court came back and said death penalty is constitutional, but it's not constitutional if the verdict wasn't unanimous. So in Maine, we have to have unanimous verdicts, but in Florida, they do not. And the Supreme Court in previous cases has says a 9-3, so 9 to convict and 3 to acquit is okay. So that's what has happened. There are a few people on death row in Florida that had non-unanimous verdicts. So I'm working on 2 cases at the moment that they're going to go for a new trial. So the attorneys, as part of being a good attorney, they want forensic scientists from 2020 to look at the case. These are cases from the 90s. and as you know, as the listeners probably know, you don't get a death sentence for what I sometimes call a normal murder. There's normally some aggravating factors. So if the person murdered more than one person, or they murdered a police officer, or they murdered somebody in the course of another felony. So maybe it was a rape and murder, or there was some sort of torture. So these are serious cases. The people I'm working for, the Innocence Project, take on cases that are not necessarily people, they're not trying to get people off on technical reasons. They believe that the individuals are truly innocent. So those are the types of cases I'm working on at the moment.
How did you get connected with the Innocence Project? Did they reach out to you?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. It's been quite a few years I've worked for them, maybe 6 or 7. I set up my own forensic consulting company back in 2012 after I'd left the crime lab. I missed the casework, and I had certifications that I wanted to maintain. And then I realized it's important, as well, as if I'm teaching forensic science, that I'm not teaching, what I learned in college 20 years ago, that I'm keeping up to date. So the casework is an extra, sometimes burden, but it also means that when the cases are finished, I can use them in class. So that's a huge, it differentiates me and Thomas College from other colleges, which I think is great. And the students love when the class is authentic, that I'm not just teaching a theory, that here's an example. Sometimes I say, don't even read chapter 2. Let's just learn the content of chapter 2 looking at this one case. So that's really helpful. And it's a really fun way to teach too, not to be teaching, from the textbook. So after I set up my forensic consulting company, I did a few free trainings. I didn't want to go up against the crime lab in Maine, so I don't really work Maine cases. I've been asked to work 1 or 2, and I said no. So I helped the public defenders in Massachusetts. So my colleagues down in the Boston lab and the Massachusetts crime lab are like, oh no, Alicia's got hired again. She's at the other side of the fence. So my colleagues down there, they know or they'll hear the defense has hired a footwear examiner, and then think it's probably Alicia. So I did a few free trainings for the public defenders in Massachusetts, and then they hired me for cases they needed. And I think it's word of mouth. I think the first Innocence Project was a New England Innocence Project case, but I've worked some really high profile ones. One that some of the listeners might have heard of, there was another podcast called In the Dark. I don't know, Kate, if you've listened to that one.
I love it. It's brilliant.
Yes. Season 2. Was it season 2 that was on Curtis Flowers?
I think it's season 2.
Yeah, that was my case. So I worked on that years ago, and had to stay quiet. So I normally sign confidentiality agreements and stay quiet. But when it broke there that they were not going to try him again for the 7th trial, I was able to say that was my case. So I had a part to play in that.
I should have put that together with the footwear, because it was such a big deal with the sneakers. And I love that podcast because it's it's really in-depth reporting and journalism, and it shows you what impressive science and journalism can do. That's just my editorial comment. And the doggedness of that reporting team was just extraordinary. And
the unsung interns that went, I should remember the prosecuting attorney's name.
Doug Evans,
that went to all of Doug Evans's trials for all of his whole long career, and looked up old little ledgers and slips of paper, and got all of the data on all of the juries that he put together, put it into an Excel spreadsheet, and found that there was a statistical significant reason that he was choosing white jurors over black jurors. It wasn't just a theory anymore, it's mathematically proven. And then the Supreme Court used that data to make the decision on Curtis Flowers. Wow.
Yeah, it's just, the whole thing was extraordinary. And this is one of those things where if I had a physical copy of like a CD cover, I'd have you sign it, because it was that cool. The fact that you were involved with it, I think, is really just fantastic.
I remember planting seeds out in the garden, listening to it in my earphones, and I had finished my work on the case when the podcast came out. I'm like, whoa. Pretty cool.
Very cool. Very cool. So I was going to ask you if you have cases or if you have kind of best memories. So I'm going to assume that's kind of up there. Do you have other cases that you've worked on that you're really proud of?
Yeah, I say to students that are thinking about going into forensic science, you have to be a patient person, and I'm sometimes not. My colleagues at the crime lab will attest to that, because most of the time, probably 9 out of 10, all the work you do is for nothing. So you're sort of looking, you don't know if you're going to find a piece of evidence or something that's important. And you think a lot of murders are domestic violence related. So if you find DNA or fingerprints, it doesn't mean anything. So they still want you to look. So sometimes, I suppose my one case that I'd like to talk about is the murder of Don Rosignol, the Colby College student that was murdered in 2003 in September. I was quite new at the crime lab at the time. I was in my first year, and I remember going out to the crime scene just outside Colby College's parking lot down the road a little bit. I live in Waterville, so it's in my own hometown, and processing the scene, and it was so exciting. It seems weird to say that, but there was a lot of buzz. There was a lot of news media there. It was just like what you would see on the TV. So it helped the medical examiner, some other detective, put her body in. She was found in a stream, put her body into a body bag, and remove her to the medical examiner's office for her autopsy the following day. And then we were missing her handbag and her cell phone. We were searching for those items, and we didn't really know what had happened. It was just a body. We were wondering, was it a party? Did she have beers and the night before and fall in? What happened here? Is it an accident? We weren't quite sure until the autopsy was done the following day. But the following day, I was told to stay back at the crime lab and process Dawn's vehicle for fingerprints and for trace and hairs and collect any items like that. And I was really disappointed. A colleague of mine, he was a detective, and he's I think he's lieutenant now, Lieutenant David Tripp in the Maine State Police. And he and I, who didn't know each other, were told to stay back. So it was I felt like it was a kick in the teeth. Stay back because you're the new person. And I wanted to be at the crime scene because it was exciting. And the lab garage with the car was not so exciting. So it was the first time I'd ever processed a vehicle by myself. I processed cars with another forensic scientist. So thinking back, it probably wasn't ideal to set me loose on a vehicle in what later turned out to be a whodunit murder, which are really rare, a stranger abduction murder. And so I was processing the car for evidence, and Detective David Tripp, was inventorying. So he had to write down everything that we found. Our car was so lovely and clean. It had a strong smell of strawberry air freshener. A lot of the cars I processed over the years have been disgusting. Dawn's was just as neat as a pin. And in my training in college, because I did my training in the United Kingdom and Scotland, we'd always been trained. They were a little bit ahead of the curve in the UK with touch DNA. When I moved to Maine, we had an unwritten policy of only taking one swab from a car, and the only swab that they took at the time was from the steering wheel. So whether it was a burglary or a homicide, there was the kind of one swab rule, because DNA was time consuming and expensive, and we weren't really doing touch DNA. So being left to my own devices, I got really nervous. I was on high alert that I wouldn't miss anything. And I thought to myself, I'm going to stick my neck out here. And I took 18 swabs, and I was worried I was going to get in trouble. So when they all came back at the end of the day, I talked to my colleague, Jen Sabian. She was a DNA examiner, and she's still there at the lab. And I said to her, I took 18 swabs, but the Q-tips are only a few pennies each, and we can put these into the freezer and never analyze them. You can just do the steering wheel as usual. I just wanted to make sure we had them, because once I do the swabbing for DNA, if I come in and then process for fingerprints, I could ruin the DNA. So I took all the swabs first. So I took swabs of the steering wheel, of the anything that was textured, the little button at the bottom of the rear view mirror that you might use to adjust, the exterior handles, all 4 exterior handles, all 4 interior levers that you would use to get out of the car, and then the plastic handles if you're sitting into the car, the little handle you would hold to pull the car door closed, any textured areas. So Jen said, well, this is real high profile, and I'm going to have to work over the weekend anyway. It'll take me just almost the same length of time to analyze one swab as opposed to 18. So she analyzed all 18. and we got a full profile of the driver's door handle that you would use to close. So that's never really been swabbed in Maine before. And to make a long story short, a week later, they in Utah had uploaded Edward Hackett was the defendant, Edward Hackett's DNA into their system, and we got a hit. So we were able to solve it. Now, if I hadn't have taken that swab, we may never have caught Edward Hackett, and he would have probably gone on and done another case. He had been convicted in Utah, Salt Lake City, and served, I think, 10 years in prison for abducting a young blonde-haired individual from a parking lot in the middle of the day, driving her in her own car to a lover's lane where a police officer came upon the vehicle because he was on patrol, and he had had this young lady stripped naked and he was going to sexually assault her. The officer stopped him in time. So he was charged with kidnapping, sexual assault, and robbery. And he pled to the kidnapping and robbery, did a plea agreement with I talked to my students about the weaknesses of the plea bargaining system. It means they got a conviction against Edward Hackett without having to go to trial, but he didn't plead to the sexual part, even though that was his motivation. And he never ended up on the sex offenders registry, which might have been an extra, protection we would have had here in Maine. So he was on parole from Utah, and he was checking in with probation officers here in Maine. He was paroled in the summer, July, I believe, and he committed this murder in September. So he drove around Waterville, hunting all summer, thinking about what he was going to do. So he was a real dangerous predator in our midst all that summer. So that was pretty cool. Jen and I got the Maine State Police award that year for the work on the case. And I felt weird because it was just, I put water on a Q-tip and swabbed a piece of plastic and put it in the freezer. And Jen said she did what she does, the same you would do for a burglary. But I suppose it was meant to be. If they had placed a different forensic scientist at the lab that day, they might have just done the steering wheel. I don't know. But it changed how we process things at the crime lab. And it kind of went nationwide. I remember talking to people at conferences, and we started solving burglaries. So we were, sometimes people think of the crime lab or the forensic science in Maine. We're really at the head of the curve. We've got the best technology in Augusta. We have a huge solve rate, small but mighty. We presented our findings on that homicide and then future burglaries at conferences, and changed how different labs across the nation processed for touch DNA.
Do you ever have a difficult time with the topics and the situations that you have to step into?
Yes. That case, Dawn's case, still comes back to me. I remember the weather. I know I like to jog. I'm in a Central Maine running club, and recently we were running in that area, and I didn't want to jog down that road, so I've not been back. I think because it was just so unfortunate, it was 7:20 in the morning. It's one thing, it's awful to say that it's one thing to get a body in a trash can from a prostitute in Massachusetts. All lives are important, but for some reason, some of them just seem so unfair. Why at 7:20 when she was going to an eye doctor's appointment that she was attacked by this individual? And she was the same age as my sister, who was, Dawn was a biology major. My sister was in college for science. So I think there was you're trying not to make a connection, but it was obviously there. So I still think about her. I can remember vividly every detail of the crime scene. Other difficult ones were children and babies, often abused. So if you go to an autopsy and a baby has just stopped breathing is one thing, but a baby who has its spleen ruptured, and then that they died a slow, painful death for 5 days. So that's really difficult. What I try to do in those cases is I do the self-talk and think, well, you're the best person in the state of Maine. Your colleague dealt with a baby last week and she doesn't want to come down to see the infant today. So you are next in line, and you have gone to college for X amount of years. You've gone to all the best training. So you're the one who's going to do the best job, and you must stay strong and process this body for evidence. So I think of it that way. I think of putting myself as the best person to do the job, rather than, throw up in the trash can and run away, that you kind of rise to the occasion, think about the family, think about justice, and then just kind of narrowly focus in. If I'm taking fingerprints, or if I'm taking, photographs of bite marks, I'm thinking about the settings on the camera, the how can I collect the best evidence? So focus in on the task at hand. In the end of my career at the crime lab, because I became a mother, they became a bit more sensitive to me. So I remember one case out of Bangor where this poor young woman had she felt unwell. She drove herself to the emergency room. While she was gone, her boyfriend killed her toddler, and he bit him on the arm and threw him down the stairs. So I had to take a photograph of a bite mark for an odontologist in California. We don't have a forensic odontologist in Maine, so we export those or outsource those evidence types. So when I came down, the little boy's body was all covered in, the blue cloth that they use at the medical examiner's office, and just his little arm was peeping out. So I was able to take the photographs of just the bite mark on his tiny little arm. My kids were the same age. I've got twins. They were the same age at the time. So I think the medical examiner was sensitive to that. Prior to being a mother, nobody covered anything up. I don't have a vision of him, which is probably helpful. I don't know what he looked like. I just know it was hard enough to see the little arm. Yeah, so I think maybe I'm ageist. The young people, the children, the people that lived a low risk lifestyle and got somehow in the wrong place at the wrong time.
One of the other good things of shadowing and following other people is seeing how it affects you. So before you decide to do that for a career.
Yeah, but that's funny because I didn't have any job shadowing in forensic science. I'm lucky. I remember my first autopsy. Steve Drake was my boss and sergeant at the time, and he said, today there's two autopsies. They're finishing off one, and we've got a police involved shooting where an officer had fired at somebody and they had died, and we walked across the parking lot down to the autopsy, and he said to me, so if you don't like what you see, or if you feel faint, or if you've had enough, just say something along the lines like, oh, I'm a very busy day, I need to head back to the lab. So he gave me a little bit of an out, which I was like, okay, all right, I'll say that if I think I need to, but I think I'm a hard person and I'm going to be able to do this. So we get in anyway, and they're finishing up a Y incision. So they had a person, I think, had died of an overdose, and they were stitching back up the Y incision, and I put his clothing, his box of shorts and his items into different paper bags and was ready to, and then I'd seen the end of one. I'd seen somebody's ribs and somebody's innards. I'd seen them being sewed up, and then we went on to the individual that had been shot. So the medical examiner, and the smell was really, really strong because all the intestinal juices and everything, it smells like the worst. It depends on the body. If it's a fresh one, it just smells like really bad diarrhea, that kind of smell, really strong. So we've got onto the individual that had been shot, and the medical examiner kind of put his finger behind the skin and was kind of poking around. And for anyone who's ever fainted before, for me, the first thing that kind of happens is, again, ringing in my ears, and then, things begin to close down. So I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to faint. And I thought, oh my goodness, I don't want to faint here on this gross floor. And I don't want to faint in front of these people. So I barely got out of my mouth before I, fainted. I said, I'm very busy back at the crime lab, I have to go. So I rushed over to the trash can and pulled up all my booties and masks and all the other things I had. I got outside the door, and there was a step, and I sat down on a step for it must have been a half an hour. I had my head between my legs. And then I mustered up the energy. The autopsy suite is in the basement of the medical examiner. So I came up the stairs and came through the offices, and they're all looking at me and like, how was it? I was like, good. I just have a lot to do to stay back at the lab. So I go back to the lab, and they said to me, are you okay? I was like, I'm fine. They said, you're completely green. So even after half an hour of my head between my legs was completely green in the face. And then I was really worried the next time I had to go that it would happen again, but it didn't. I sort of talked myself out of it, said, don't be. So I stopped at that point in time. What happened was he had taken off the skull cap. He'd retracted the scalp backwards. So what they do is they make a cutting at the base of the back of the skull, and they fold the skin forward. So you can't see the face. You're sort of looking at the inside of the scalp. And then they get it's just like a saw you can buy in Home Depot. It's a little Dremel, and they take off the skull cap. And I was I was far too up close and personal. I didn't need to be doing that. And as they took off the skull cap, there was a rush of gas. And the medical examiner said, oh, that's just head gas. And it smelled disgusting. So after that, instead of being inquisitive and examining, I just like, what do you need me to do? Just photograph this bite, just collect the fingerprints, just overall help with the autopsy, whatever function I was doing that day. And I wasn't, examining kidneys, brains, things I didn't need to look at. So that was how I kind of coped with the autopsies over the years.
Good tips for anyone who might want to go into this is to narrow what they really need to do.
Yeah. Well, some people are, I think for a medical examiner, they're very interested. They're examining every little aspect of the body, and that's what they have to do. But I didn't want to let my side down and faint. So
do you have any upcoming projects or teaching in particular that you're really excited about?
Yes. So I'm excited about this concentration that we have at Thomas. In the new year, I'm teaching a class I have not taught before, death investigations. So I've started putting together my modules for death investigation. So week 1 in the spring, we're going to talk about death. How do people die? So just natural death we're going to talk about, and we'll work our way through entomology, decomposition, all the little critters that in Maine, most bodies don't decompose. They're eaten up by little rodents, and our raccoons in Maine are very hungry. They do a lot. Dr. Marcy Sword out of the University of Maine, who you probably know, has done some very cool research on the little mammals that eat humans during the cold weather season, which is most of the year for us in Maine. So yeah, I'm excited about the new courses I'm teaching next semester.
Alicia, this has just been a joy. At the very first science festival, you set up a crime scene investigation, which was really, really interesting. And I've kind of followed your work from the shadows since then. I have always enjoyed talking with you. And I have a much better appreciation of all the work that you do. I'm embarrassed to say I only had a glancing idea, but I think that the work that you do is extraordinary. And I think the fact that you are able to act as this really cool liaison about the science to lawyers and attorneys and people in the general public, I think is exactly what we need. So I wanted to thank you for that.
Thanks, Kate.
The Maine Science Podcast has received support from the Maine Technology Institute and is recorded at Discovery Studios at the Maine Discovery Museum in Bangor, Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is produced and edited by me, Kate Dickerson. I received production support from Miranda Bouchard. The Discover Maine theme was composed and performed by Nick Parker.